Once again, I welcome all of you here. We're going to start with Mr. Chrvine Oftadeh from Unodc to really kind of give us a landscape of trafficking within Nigeria, what some of the indicators are, what some of the trends have been over the last year, 2 years. UNODC prepared a report for trafficking in Nigeria for 2020, so he'll go into discussions about that as well. So please help me welcome Chrvine.
Thank you, Ivan. So good morning again, everyone. So I'm waiting for the presentation to go. All right. So, yeah, as Ivan mentioned, UNODC conducted a baseline assessment of human trafficking in Nigeria last year, but as you may already know, UNODC also produces every 2 years for the UN General Assembly a global report on human trafficking worldwide. So what I'm going to do is that I'll have two presentations. The first one is on the global report on human trafficking of UNODC, focusing on the findings in sub-Saharan Africa and some findings on West Africa. But I won't be too long on that. Right after, I will jump into more details in our findings in Nigeria specifically, because that's what really interests us most today. So, yeah, the last report of the last global report of UNODC on trafficking in person dates back from 2018. But I would like to tell you right now that actually on the 2nd of February, so I think it's in only 2 weeks from now, we will publish our 4th report. So we will send you, of course, to every one of you, if you're interested, a link to follow the launch, which will present the key findings. But for now, we're looking at the last report. So the findings that we have, that I'm presenting here, are quite similar to the findings that we had in our report that we will launch in 2 weeks. So it's quite very still relevant here. So globally, as we can see on the victims profile, is that most victims are actually children. As you can see, 30% of victims identified worldwide were young girls, and 25% were young boys. So actually half of victims that are identified worldwide are children. Men represented the less, the most minor part, with 16% of globally worldwide being men. Next slide, please. So here on focusing on Africa, as you can see, West Africa is the region that detects the most, the biggest number of victims of trafficking on the continent. So that can be for various reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have more victims of trafficking in the region. It may also mean actually that the capacities to detect victims are better in the region than in East or South Africa. Can you go back? Yeah, thank you. So as you can see here, I hope everybody can. You can see that we split between West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, and you can see the share of men, women, boys, and girls. So as I was saying before, you can see that girls, for example, especially in West Africa, have the highest share of victims. Men, on the opposite, are less identified or less victims of trafficking. In terms of the forms of exploitation, on all the continents, trafficking for forced labor represents over 60% of cases, followed by trafficking for sexual exploitation, 1 case out of 3, and then trafficking for other persons was the smallest share. That has been confirmed by our new report that we will launch. Again, as you can see, we disaggregated the data for the three main regions of sub-Saharan Africa, and as you can see, I hope that the trafficking for forced labor in West Africa is almost twice the number of cases of trafficking for sexual exploitation, which is also quite high. Then we have trafficking for urban renewal and trafficking for other purposes, but really trafficking for forced labor and then for sexual exploitation are represented the high majority of cases in sub-Saharan Africa and in particular in West Africa. In terms of the offenders, as you can see, we disaggregated the data between offenders that are being investigated, prosecuted, and convicted. The interesting figure here is the share of women in being investigated. In sub-Saharan Africa, almost half of offenders are actually women, 48%. But that number really decreased when we get into the prosecution and then into the conviction. So half of the offenders being investigated are women, but in the end, in terms of conviction, that rate drops lower than 40%. It's important also to mention that actually West Africa is the region where you have the most women offenders being investigated. In other regions, usually it's mostly in West Africa, we see that trend where you have a higher number of women being suspected. In terms of offenders, again, here we're looking at the nationality of offenders being prosecuted. So in sub-Saharan African countries, most offenders being convicted are national, and that's also confirmed in Nigeria. When we look, for example, at NACTIV data, most offenders convicted are Nigerians. And on the continent, close to 85% of offenders being convicted are from the country where they have been convicted. Same for the flows. As you can see, the origin of trafficking victims detected in West Africa. So the victims that West African countries identify, usually victims come from the region. The victims are generally not coming from other regions. It's like 99%. So we're talking really about almost all victims of human trafficking in the region. In terms of the flows, we try to also show where victims should go when it's where they would be identified outside Nigeria. So we are showing you here the trends of identified sub-Saharan victims in Western and Southern Europe, as well as in North Africa and the Middle East. As you can see, the trend has been an increasing number of victims being identified in Europe, and in the same time, a drop in terms of the number of victims identified in North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, that over the last 2 years has changed, with an increasing number now of victims identified in the Middle East. And I think what is relevant to mention here is probably what's happening in the Gulf countries, especially with some Nigerian victims being identified there, but I will come to that in a picture in my presentation. So that's the overall map, as I was telling you a bit before. Most victims are identified in sub-Saharan Africa itself. The share of sub-Saharan victims identified in Europe is close to 20%. In North Africa and the Middle East, it was around 11%, but now it has increased over the last 2 years. And in the other regions, so North America and East Asia, the numbers of sub-Saharan victims is very little compared to In terms of law enforcement response, so here what you can see is the number of convictions. I hope you can see it. I will share the presentation with afterwards. But what you should see here is that the number of convictions in all countries, not necessarily only Nigeria, remains relatively low in the region compared to all other regions worldwide. So what we did is that over the period of 2014 to 2017, we took 1 year where we had the most number of convictions, in the different countries, and no country in all sub-Saharan Africa that were studied had more than 50 convictions. When you think about the number of victims identified that I showed previously in my presentation, that shows that the number of convictions remain relatively low. So you have in sub-Saharan Africa only 6 countries which had between 11 to 50 prosecutions, and the rest of them had less than 11 prosecutions. Including 6 where we don't have information. But so for example, you have 5 countries where you have no convictions for 1 year, and others where you have 8 countries where you have between 1 and 10 convictions. So again, when we put that against the number of victims, and that's what we can see here. It's not really clear, but basically you can see that the line, the axis at the bottom shows the number of persons convicted, and as you can see, sub-Saharan Africa is the one that has the lowest conviction rate, and on the left is the number of victims detected, which is still high. So sub-Saharan African countries still have that challenge. I think that's what interests us today in the conviction rate, in terms of identification of victims, but also in terms of convicting the trafficker. So now I'm going more into the Nigerian context. Just a few words. This baseline assessment was made thanks to the funding of the Swiss government. We are supporting NAFTIP at the moment, and some of you I think are already aware of developing a national action plan against human trafficking. And I think that will be presented tomorrow. So UNODC had this approach to actually, before working on the national action plan, what we thought would be interesting is actually to have an overview of what the situation is, and that would serve as a baseline to actually develop this action plan. So I'm just going into not all the findings, but I can share again the full baseline report with all of you. But here I will focus on specific aspects, because otherwise it's very too long. So on the victims, I think it's not a big surprise. It confirms the trend at the continent level. Most victims are women and children. As I said before, the main form of exploitation are forced labor and sexual exploitation. In terms of cases investigated, this is NAFTIP data for your information. So we have more domestic cases than cross-border cases being investigated. In terms of victims that have been assisted, over 1,000 in 2019. So you can see again, when you compare the number of victims and the number of cases, that there's still quite a gap. So the same trend that we see at the continent level, 50% of the victims are children, and you have 3-4 times girls than young boys, and then only 6% of men. In NAFTIP data, some victims are actually not trafficking victims; they're victims of other offenses, but that's just So in terms of the different forms, again, I think that you're already quite familiar with these different issues. Domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, revolting, dating, forced labor in mining, agriculture, exploitation in baby factories. That has been the baby factories aspect has been quite recent actually, and it's difficult to see how many specific cases we have at the moment being prosecuted. We don't have that level of detail in terms of the data, but I think that's maybe something that we would like to discuss during this event. But can we come back? trafficking for organ removal. I also know that this has been something that it was quite strong on over the last couple of years, and even you mentioned it a bit earlier. So yeah, Peggy Factory, this is really the increasing aspect, not only in the south, but also cases in the north. And maybe I will take this opportunity to let you know that this baseline assessment, this is based on interviews that we conducted with over 40 people from the ministries, law enforcement agencies, NGOs. So this is really the reflection of key actors that we interviewed. It's not like our own recruitment of children for use in armed conflict. This is particularly relevant for what's happening in the northeast. Unfortunately, we don't have that number of cases, but this is more like what we heard. This is more like reports and actual data from NATIV or other law enforcement agencies. And then the insecurity and the situation in IDP camps. This is an important point. What's happening in the IDP is based on a report from the UNHCR, our sister UN agency, where they show significant rates of sexual exploitation across the different IDP camps. And I exchanged with some civil society organizations last week who are working in IDP camps in the Plateau region. And apparently the COVID crisis has made things even worse because people are even more vulnerable, they have less services. So obviously, when they get more vulnerable to trafficking, that we need to. So cross-border cases, we have a lot of cases in West Africa. So cases of young women and girls sexually exploited in Mali that has been quite digitized some time ago. But also in Burkina Faso and other countries. Now we have in the Middle East and Gulf states increasing domestic servitude cases. I think that during the COVID-19, the summer, we had a number of Nigerians who came back from Lebanon. I think IOM provided support to them from that home. So that showed also a new trend. And actually, we had over 200 return victims from 18 countries in 2019, but no returns from European countries. That is something that I think is quite important in terms of the trends, because these victims return from countries mostly from West Africa, the Middle East, including Lebanon, UAE, but also Libya. We talked a lot about the trafficking victims, Nigerian victims in Europe, but as you see in 2019, no returns from Europe. In terms of men, we saw some men exploited in prostitution, but also as drug mules. So here we go into different forms of trafficking. And in Europe, some victims have been directly recruited from ISIL and reception. So yeah, in the EU, I just wanted to make a point on that because the EU at the end of 2020 published its third report on trafficking in persons, and there are some interesting findings when it comes to Nigeria. And we are talking, and we will talk about transnational cooperation during this training. I think it's important to mention these numbers. I'm sure that all of you have been in contact to some extent with some European partners on this. So in the EU, they make the distinction between EU victims and non-EU victims. When it comes to non-European Union victims, the main country represented among victims is Nigeria, with over 3,000 victims. Then in terms of the proportion of victims for sexual exploitation, so if you look at the different nationalities and among these nationalities, who has the highest share of victims for sexual exploitation, again, it's Nigeria. It's close to 70% of Nigerian victims identified with the European Union being victims of sexual exploitation. Again, the share of female victims, if you look at the different countries, trafficking. Nigerians shows the highest share of female victims. Over 90% of Nigerian victims identified with the youth are female. So that was more on the victims side. If we look at the criminal justice response in the European Union against trafficking, 26%, so 1 out of 4 suspects in the European Union for human trafficking are non-EU citizens, and among these non-EU citizens, Nigerians are the highest share. You had, for example, over 300 Nigerians being prosecuted in the European Union in 2017 and 60 Nigerian convicted. So this shows that Nigeria is still a priority in the European country, and we will get to that when we talk about the international cooperation. Maybe one last word on the European Union that is not shown here, and I think that our colleagues are here. We saw that actually over the last 2-3 years, significant drop in numbers of Nigerians arriving to the EU. So what would be interesting is actually to see are there new routes that smugglers and trafficking are using? Because I personally can't buy to the story of like Nigerians are not migrating anymore. So there's something that we will need to monitor in the next couple of months and years. Are there new routes to the Gulf countries within West Africa, or other routes towards Europe, or is it more difficult to identify victims of trafficking? But that's something really important because Nigerians, I think, was at 2016 and 2017 represented the highest share of migrants arriving to Italy. And since 2018, they're not even in the top 10 of nationals identified when migrants identified when they arrive to Italy. So that's a huge change that we need to take into account, and I think that data related to other regions would be most welcome. Okay, so now in terms of the profiles of the traffickers, so the main conclusion of that is actually that we don't have a key conclusion. Basically, it depends a lot on the type of the form of exploitation, on the destination, is it domestic or is it cross-border trafficking. So you have different traffickers that we can see that have been identified by the different partners. So you have the Madame for the sexual exploitation cases, both at domestic but also at international level. You have the domestic trafficking of child, domestic. It's more like opportunistic individuals that can involve also family members. When it comes to domestic workers in the Middle East, here we see that we have some employment or travel agencies that are involved in the trafficking process. Then we have more sophisticated, more organized criminal groups and networks of smugglers and traffickers. This is particularly true when it comes to sexual exploitation in Europe. And there's also the role of both groups, especially linked to sexual exploitation in Europe. For example, on these groups, I know that in Italy and France, over the last 2 or 3 years, there have been cases and convictions mentioning specifically some of these groups as organized criminal organizations linked to sexual exploitation. And then, lastly, on other cases, I wanted also to say a few words on another aspect, which is more Nigeria as a destination country. We talked a lot about actually Nigerian victims in Nigeria but elsewhere, but there's also this aspect which is very strong in Nigeria, which is the destination countries, especially at the West African level. So you have West African children and adults who are exploited for instances of forced labor and sexual exploitation in Nigeria. For example, in 2019, NAPTIP rescued close to 75 victims from other countries. Almost half of them came from the Benin Republic, and then we had 16% coming from Ghana, and the rest came from other countries. In terms of the new trends, as I mentioned before, the number of Nigerian victims in the EU will probably decrease, but what is happening in Niger and Libya, I think that according to IOM, early 2020, so a year ago, we still had like over 50,000 Nigerians stuck in Libya. So what's happening there? What's happening on the new routes? What's happening in Niger? Are Nigerians still going to Niger, to Mali, to Burkina? Are there victims in other countries? I think it's very important to also tackle that aspect. It's not because it's less Nigerians in Europe that the problem disappeared at the international level. It may just be in other regions, in West Africa, but also in the Gulf countries, in North Africa. And then, this report that we did tackled the different components for an efficient action plan. So we looked at prevention and protection, at the coordination between different partners, all these different aspects that are required for an efficient response against human trafficking. And we also looked, of course, at the criminal justice response and law enforcement aspects. So this training dedicated to that. I'm just going to say a few words on that specific aspect. NAPTIP is the agency against human trafficking, as we know, of course, to enforce the Trafficking Act and the Violence Against Person Act. But we also have, and that's why I mentioned this, we also have, and you can see the group, so many different partners involved: the Immigration Service, in charge of implementing the Immigration Act, the police force, the SS, and so many other partners, and also at state level with the different task forces, the state ministries of justice, etc. So it's just to show how wide the range of different stakeholders in Nigeria, but also in other countries, but in particular in Nigeria, is really significant, and the cooperation and coordination in action is that leads me to the cooperation when it comes to specific cases. One challenge that we seem to see is the necessary cooperation with NAPTIP in terms of referral of cases. UNODC a couple of years ago had supported the development of standard operating procedures with the different law enforcement agencies and other partners to facilitate that cooperation. It still seems that there are some challenges on that in different parts of the countries. We also know that the Nigerian police force has its own SOPs on trafficking. NIS, APF, and other partners have their own anti-trafficking units. So it's more like how these different partners, these different units cooperate with each other, cooperate with NAPTIP. I think that in Edo, and I was listening to the different introduction, and you hear all this Joint Border Task Force, Edo State Task Force, NIS, NAPTIP, ODSS, which is great. It's just like how do you really work together? What are the challenges in your cooperation? Sometimes it's really very practical challenges. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be at an institutional level. It's more like on a day-to-day basis. What could be done to improve the exchange of information between the different partners? This is really a key challenge, and it's not proper to Nigeria. In a lot of countries, this biggest issue on interagency coordination. Just can you come back to it? Thank you. So in terms of the challenges I just mentioned, the coordination, but there are a lot of other challenges. So in 2019 for NAPTIP, again, this is not data, we had over 200 cases being investigated, but there are a lot of challenges that were identified by the people we interviewed in terms of necessary skills, in terms of resources, funding, corruption, the reluctance of victims to cooperate. I heard that a lot actually, and I think it was mentioned also by our colleagues in Italy. In terms of like the trust of victims, are they being comfortable to cooperate, to help in the cases? Their role is really key. Lack of awareness of the crime, I think this has been mentioned also by Ivan a bit earlier. So there are a lot of different issues that needs to be tackled. I also think that on the investigation, one thing we had identified, and that was actually NAPTIP's previous action plan, was the need for more forensic-based investigations, the use of more financial investigations to have like stronger investigation. I would be very interested during this training to hear more from you to what extent that has been done or what needs to be done. I think we as Unodc can really greatly in the coming years to support you on that, but we would like to hear on what you would really need. That's an important point. On prosecutions, we didn't have data from NAPTIP for 2019. We only had data for convictions. While the data on convictions is useful, we would be really interested in having more data on prosecution from NAPTIP, but also from the state task forces, for example, because what we want to see is are there specific challenges when it comes to prosecution? Do prosecutions on trafficking cases are less successful than prosecutions for other cases? If so, why? What are the challenges that prosecutors have, or what are the issues that judges may have? So there are a lot of things that we need to analyze when it comes to prosecution. Building a trafficking case can be particularly difficult, so it requires specific training, specific approach when it comes to court, to bringing a case to court. So again, we're going to see in the coming years we have some projects dedicated to the law enforcement aspect, and we'll be very interested to hear more. What are the specific challenges when it comes to prosecuting trafficking cases? One thing that we saw was the role of NAPTIP. As you know, and it has been highlighted earlier, NAPTIP has various zonal commands. Unfortunately, they cannot be in every state, so most of the time they have one zonal command that covers 3 or 4 states, depending on where they are. And what we saw is quite blunt, is that when you have a zonal command of NAPTIP in one state, you have prosecution. Where you don't have NAPTIP zonal command, you don't have any prosecution. So that's something very important. NAPTIP has been developing, and I think you probably know that, state task forces in other states. Edo is quite a particular case, but in other states of Nigeria, is establishing these task forces, which are particularly new, so they need to, we're starting from scratch here, but their role may be very important, because when NAPTIP is not there, it seems like it's total impunity for traffickers, and also know way less about the trafficking trends and patterns in these states. So, for example, Edo has been covered a lot over the last couple of years, so we know about the issue, we have some information, some data, a lot of different partners involved, but there are other states in Nigeria where the trafficking situation may be a problem, and yet we don't know much about it, we don't have a sufficient presence there, and this we need to prevent it from becoming endemic areas. One specific point on the organized criminal groups. We don't have specific data again on that. So we have that we have data on the number of prosecutions, but what we found a bit challenging is to identify when are we talking about organized criminal groups and when are we talking only about opportunistic individuals. I think that's one of the key challenges when it comes to investigating and prosecuting trafficking cases. Is that something, I mean, most of the time, again, a bit everywhere, we manage to catch, let's say, a small fish, but if you want to get to the people who are at the higher ranks of the criminal organization, it becomes harder. So we also are trying to push towards that kind of approach, trying to tackle the group rather than just individuals. And we have the feeling that, based on our own analysis, that over 60% of prosecutions relate to some extent to an organized group. The definition of the United Nations of an organized criminal group is very broad. It doesn't need to be like this huge mafiosi kind of group. It can be only like 3 or 4 people organizing the trafficking of young girls, not necessarily huge numbers. So again, we need to tackle that organized approach when we investigate and prosecute trafficking. But of course, that requires much more resources, much more capacity, so that you can tackle networks and not only individuals. And that relates to what I said before in terms of what needs to improve. And one point on the joint law enforcement operation to deal with the international networks. Unodc, for example, has employed liaison magistrates to Nigerian liaison magistrates to Italy and to Spain to strengthen that international cooperation in trafficking cases. We are still at the early stages of that initiative, but it's showing some very interesting results, and that's something that we want to extend in other European countries, but also at the regional level. And that's something that we've seen in Italy and Spain, but other countries are being interested. Especially what we saw was that the organized criminal group were much more sophisticated when it came to international cross-border cases than when it was on specific domestic cases where you have more opportunistic individuals. So when you want to catch the big guns, if I may say, transnational cooperation seems absolutely crucial. So on the way forward, on the criminal justice response, based on our assessment, as I said, cooperation in the referral of cases is crucial. More coordination on investigation and prosecution, more exchange of information. That is particularly key. Need for more intelligence-led and financial investigation. Have more judges specialized on human trafficking. I think that's the case in Edo, but in other states we don't have that level of expertise on trafficking issues. Analysis of national prosecution, as I mentioned, I think it's interesting to get in depth into when it comes to prosecution, what is working, what is not working, how can we improve, what are the lessons learned. An increasing role for other law enforcement agencies. I'm happy to see that we have an IS, we have the SF, the police, also we see that the EFCC and FIU, for example, have been involved in international cooperation in specific cases when it came to illicit assets, illicit financial flow, so that their role could also be very relevant to your work, and maybe also extend to other relevant law enforcement agencies. And then on international cooperation, I mentioned the initiative that we are supporting working with Italy and Spain. But there are also been successful operations in other countries, Germany, the UK. But again, I think that the focus should not necessarily be Europe. It's also building cooperation with neighboring countries. Benin Republic, Niger, Cameroon are also countries where actually Nigeria should probably cooperate more. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much. And again, we will have our global report launched in 2 weeks from now. So stay tuned, and now we'll share that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chrvine. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to, this will be the time to do that. I can start actually. I have a question from 18 countries, but I don't know European return. Are you relating that to voluntary return to the IOM system or deportation or both? Because I'm surprised that there were no deportations from Europe or Nigeria in 2019 at all.
These figures show when NAPTIP was directly involved when it comes to returns from European countries. I think that NAPTIP is not necessarily involved, at least in the initial stages. It's more like a diplomatic arrangement at the ministry's level. I think this is more like when it comes to like NAPTIP being involved, they have identified the case with their embassy. So there has been probably some European returns, but I think the fact that there are no European cases when it comes to NAPTIP specific ones shows because that had been the case in previous years. 2019 was the first one when we saw that. That was quite surprising. And on the other side, increase of returns from Middle Eastern countries, I think that shows another.
The aspect of institutions, the methods, their own conditions, whether they were 2019. I think it's very easy to tell the records for cases of trafficking and other debate and all of those. We don't have it yet. So we have people because the conditions become as a result of
at the time when we did the report, so back in summer 2020, we had data from 2019 on convictions, so successful prosecution, we can put it that way, but we didn't have the data from NAPTIP on ongoing prosecutions. NAPTIP produced that kind of data, but what we only had back in the time was data that was going up until 2017 when it comes to prosecution. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I'm actually gazing with NAPTIP on their up-to-date data in headquarters. So hopefully we will have that kind of data, because usually they produce it. They produce the data on prosecution and going cases being investigated and prosecuted. When I saw the report from our expert, I just think that that was over a certain number of years, and I think that talking with some also NAPTIP colleagues in the field, when I can reach them, it's also that going from one state to another is already quite a lot of work, and then if you need to prosecute that case in that specific state, it requires the capacity, the manpower to be there. I can definitely understand that if you have, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have only a few prosecutors and investigators that need to cover 4 states of Nigeria, that's going to require you need much more. And once you have limited resources to do your job, maybe you're focusing on the cases in your state because you have more resources and more chances to get that case successful. That's how I would say it. I know that NAPTIP has been pushing to have more zonal commands, and now they're doing this task force aspect, and I know that in some states, for now, this task force has been, for example, a way to gain one NAPTIP staff in the task force, a state where they don't have the zonal command, but they have that native staff that acts as a liaison with their zonal command and also the regional command, I think that they have. So hopefully that task force, the development of task forces will tackle the issue to some extent. But again, these task forces are just starting, and they need a lot to achieve here.
Okay.
Yeah. So in order to prosecution or completion, as also based on native data, what we found was the prosecution can be ongoing, but then it's the level of successful prosecution. How much is this prosecution result in conviction?
Yes, sir. You stated that in case of investigation or prosecution, the police were to go by using the criminal or penal code. But looking at those things, they have a design law for the offense of human trafficking. How are you going to harmonize that in terms of prosecution?
Cool. It's a very specific case, so on this one I did not mention it because I think that Edo is only or one of the only states in Nigeria that has a state law against trafficking. In other states of Nigeria, for now at least, it's not yet still implementing the CIA Act. So I think that in Edo, and I would say that I would like to hear more from you in terms of harmonization. I must say that I would like to understand more when is NAFTA in charge, when is the task force in charge, how does it work? Because in other states it's not more simple, but it's like you have the federal law and NAFTA prosecute under that specific law. So in terms of harmonization, I think it's more in terms of like how does it work in the in Edo? When do you use the state law? When do you use the federal law? Or do you use only the state law? I must say that on this question, I'm not going to pretend that I know more than you because I'm not in the field. I'm not in the need. So I think that I would like to hear more from the practitioner and Benin who knows more than me.
Is there someone here that can answer? Thank you.
Well, the question we ask as to when to draw the line and where to pursue and where to put. Because the coming on board the task force, nothing has been cases of human trafficking. I did not say that if I even find like federal high courts or state high courts, and that way because I have revision to read the numbers. So what we do usually is now is the right court, criminal division from 2 and 3. So we use state court for the same matter. But what happens is that on the causes, there are matters for nothing, while there are matters for tax force, they don't say tax force. So they have their law, they constitute their law. Why that they constitute the federal law? When you look at both laws, they're the same. The offenses are the same, the sentences, the conviction, everything about the law are the same. So the difference is that I am a federal controller, I will put the state here in Unodc. I use the federal law. Why the task force, we put in Unodc, we use the state law. I think the bottom line of the whole thing is for us to succeed in the fight against human trafficking is a collaborative responsibility. So it doesn't really matter whether they are from the task force or whether it's from the NAFTA. The bottom line of the matter is the issue that we have the power, both task force and NAFTA, to pursue either in state high court and federal high court. But it's quite different in that the same concept for the task force cannot pursue by federal high court. because they are not here. The student state then the general that the student is the general. So they cannot go to the high court to state standard. These are not the slight difference between the two.
If I understand correctly, you can go for a prosecution under the state law with a specialized court, or you can go with the federal law under the federal high court. But what I would be interested in is that do you happen to end up in a situation where actually you're investigating similar cases, and that you would need actually to share information and maybe to focus, put all efforts into one, either under the state law with the task force or the federal high court with NAPTIC. I mean, it's also like where you may need actually to join forces. I understand the objective actually to have more and more courts, more prosecutors to tackle trafficking, but sometimes it's also better to have all forces in one entity to tackle a specific case. I don't know if that question makes sense, but it's I'm just trying to also show where you may have challenges in that scenario, in that setting.
Because we have to realize that the investigators, we conduct our investigations, we have a lawyer who will do the matter, other is actually investigation from state. But some of the cases, so I'm not sure, but I look at things, I'm aware that I have like some personal costs this morning. We have police force, we have the immigration officers attached to them. So it's appears to investigate and be certified to the Minister of Justice to resolve matters. Unlike now, where we are together, we follow investigation from the onset to the conclusion of the matter. So I think the task force will be easy because they are not the police not the state. And the different organizations, though they are operating within the task force, then tend to take the Minister of Justice for the decision of the case. So there's a little difficulty in actually in getting confusion because it's not, I'm sure that's why training is all about. For us to now combine efforts to achieve common goals. Thank you very much.
Nigeria Nigerian arrivals in Europe have significantly decreased. Right, so we're not within the top 10 of arrivals, I think, since 2018 in Europe. What are your thoughts? I mean, I don't know if there's any anecdotal evidence, but right now we don't know specifically whether the rates of departures from Nigeria has actually decreased, and that is what is resulting in the fewer arrivals into Europe, or whether people are going to different countries because of Europe's efforts to prevent arrivals into Europe. Do you have any anecdotal evidence or anything that indicates specifically what may be happening? Because my concern is that, just because there's no arrivals in Europe doesn't mean that Nigeria is dying between Nigeria, whether it's Nigeria, Libya, or taking some other routes. So I'm just wondering if there's any evidence that may suggest exactly what's happening.
Well, probably more data, but that actually Nigerians are still going, and I mean, it would be, I think, naive to think that a country of 200 million of people who is used to migrating, who is so much open to the migration process from day to the next, just there's no movement anymore. So I think that would be quite naive. I actually, when I talked with these various members of NACTA last week, they were also mentioning that in 2020, when all the global focus was on COVID and how does it impact migration movement, actually it was also said that people are still going. So I think that we also saw, like, I think it was back in May, that there was some Nigerians who had crossed to Niger. I think IOM has probably also more data on that because they have this metric where they record entries and the migration movements between countries. So no, I think that the movements is still on. The challenge we have is that the sophisticated maybe way of recording data movement, data on movement, and migration when it comes to the different European routes is very elaborate. When it comes to movement, for example, within the ECOWAS region, it's much more difficult, to find data to get this information. But also, let's not forget that in the ECOWAS region, although it is in low free movement area, there are still so many challenges that you can still be a victim of trafficking, a victim of smuggling, even within the region, because the free movement protocol is not fully implemented. So no, there are still movements. I think that also the fact that there has been increasing reports of Nigerian victims in the Gulf countries. We also had late 2019 data collection work in various states in Nigeria, including Kano, and there one of the key destinations was again Gulf countries. I think this is probably a trend that we need to monitor. So yeah, I think the movement is still there, maybe not towards Europe, and even that, maybe the entry point to Europe has changed. Maybe it's not Italy anymore, but maybe it's like, I don't know, Spain or Greece, or there are a lot to say about.
Any thoughts on any anecdotal evidence to indicate why there are fewer arrivals of Nigerians into Europe? Is it that our efforts at awareness raising is improving? Are there more people being deterred from trafficking people because of prostitution? Or is it just the European efforts that has really pushed the border, from Europe versus looking at allowance in Niger? What are your thoughts on why there are fewer arrivals of Nigerians in Europe over the last few years?
I think it's a combination of lots of factors. Some of the factors we have correctly listed. Awareness raising has contributed because there's significantly very high level of information and development against irregular migration in communities and lives. So people are not so much recognizing the irregular routes. The other point you also raised, which is quite correct, is the efforts of European countries considering the border issues. So the combination of all these factors have resulted in arrivals in Europe seeing a decrease, or I don't think it's allowed some years ago. Then just to add my thoughts to what my learning friend has said to concerning question that was raised by my colleague as well, where the choice is for active or outsourced as far as prosecution. I think my thoughts are it will likely depend on who has complained and where the complaint was made. So if somebody complains to outsource, automatically the outsource will prosecute. And if somebody complains to active, automatically active will prosecute. And two, if complaining to outsource, you see the pass around it because of the state's outsource. And we are seeing that this is something that involves outside the state, probably vouching or Lagos or whatever. It just comes to the reason that we may not have that full capacity to do that because they are distributed in the state. So definitely there will that really transfer of that case.
Yes, I was really thinking about the discussion on the decrease of arrivals that, of course, we've been absolutely experiencing in Europe. And I do share many of the comments that you made. What I would like to add is just a couple of things. One is, as concerns Europe, for sure, we're very much dealing, and Gaia can say much more than that, with the arrival of Nigerian girls and women from other European countries. So people that arrived in Italy, let's say, especially around 2015 and 16, and have been going around in a circular movement. So there are high risks of trafficking, which is also an issue. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and pose it more as a question, I don't know if it's relevant, but I've been wondering about it, is what impacts all the protests connected to the end SARS may have in terms of maybe new routes or new trends in terms of trafficking, if you've got any sense of this.
I mean, on the first point, just to add a comment, that is also one critical issue, and I think I got it also correctly. The fact that there are so many Nigerians also in Europe, few convictions compared to the number of victims, so there is still a lot of work to do in terms of the law enforcement response there, and obviously the cooperation with Nigeria is crucial, and also in terms of protection and rehabilitation of the victims back in Europe. This is still crucial. The flows in the coming years will be. It's still crucial to tackle the problem in Europe. Then on the second part of the NSAS movement, I must say that I don't know, and we don't have any information on that. Has it created new flows? Again, I think IOM is tracking more on a day-to-day basis this kind of information, but I couldn't say if but maybe also other colleagues in the room may have information on it that had any impact. But from our side, we didn't hear anything on that. What we heard was more specifically on COVID. So throughout 2020, that there was still traffickers operating, still smugglers operating. That was really what we heard on the NSAS movement. I cannot, no information on that from my end. But I think someone there would.
Okay, yes, so
let's take our boundaries and factors of this. We go beyond the same. Because we have a clear and general information. So against this constant against we go beyond this. We defect our information. We backing of the clear and general information.
Please appreciate sharing Oftadeh from Unodc for that. Thank you very much.